Thanks so much to you all, the viewers, for being with us as well on this Saturday. It is July 6th. I'm your host, Carel Lajara. Do you want to switch gears? I know that just before the break, we're talking jobs numbers and the economy. But now we want to look ahead to next week and look to this trial that we have been covering very extensively here at Live Now. I'm talking about Alec Baldwin and this Rust trial. The actor being charged with involuntary manslaughter after shooting a cinematographer on the set of Rust in New Mexico. We have some footage here kind of showcasing that scene from when this first happened. It already happened about a couple of years ago, but finally we are going to get a jury selected coming up this week. I'd like to bring in now Will Bruzzo, a criminal defense attorney, with all of the details. Will, thanks so much for joining us on this Saturday. I'd first like to ask, as a criminal defense attorney, I know that jury selection starts next week. What would you look for when selecting this panel? Alec Baldwin is so famous. This story has been in the headlines for months, years now. So what needs to be done to make sure it's not biased?
I think you need to make sure that the jurors are going to be impartial, that they are going to listen to the facts without a jaundiced eye. Of course, as you mentioned, he is very famous. I think it would be good to explore the jurors' politics a little bit, see what prejudices or what knowledge they have of Mr. Baldwin before the trial starts. It might also help to look and see what people's experiences with firearms. I think that all those things would be important to look at.
How long do you expect this jury selection process to take? I know it can take a few days as we kind of filter through who's going to sit on this and decide Alec Baldwin's fate. So how long could this be? When do you expect this trial to actually get underway?
It could start this week. I don't know if they do trials on Fridays in New Mexico, but I would expect probably at least 3 days of jury selection. Each side has preemptions where they can excuse a certain number of jurors for no reason, and then of course they can excuse any juror for what is go to their impartiality if they legitimately don't believe the juror can be impartial. So they could seat a jury this week. I'd be surprised if they got much past that.
As I mentioned before, Alec Baldwin, well, here on the screen, we actually have the armor, Hannah Gutierrez Reed. She was already convicted, serving prison time for this role in the death of the cinematographer Helena Hudgens. But moving now to Alec Baldwin and his fate. He is being charged with involuntary manslaughter. Maybe explain to our viewers what this charge actually means. My understanding, maybe as a normal person, is, you kill someone, you didn't mean to do it, it was an accident. And that kind of sounds like what Alec Baldwin's case is really all about.
That sums it up pretty well. There's one element missing, and that is that the person did not act with the due care of a normal person. It's almost a civil standard. Was the person acting recklessly? Was the person not acting with the common good sense and prudence of a regular sober person? So that's something that the prosecution must prove beyond a reasonable doubt. And quite frankly, I think that's going to be difficult for the prosecution to prove here. As you mentioned, this was a set of a Western. Mr. Baldwin may have been rehearsing a scene where he was shooting a prop, which was a gun. And, when this horrible, tragic accident happened. But I think that's where the real challenge for this prosecution begins, because I don't know how they're going to prove that beyond a reasonable doubt that he wasn't acting with regular prudence of a sober person.
Surely, though, prosecutors must think that they have some sort of basis to even bring these charges forward. But I think that that's where a lot of the confusion comes, where you just mentioned there's supposed to be people on set that kind of protect Alec Baldwin. Is it really standard to think that the actor who believes he is shooting a prop gun is going to be held accountable when it has a live bullet in it and unfortunately kills someone?
I don't think it's realistic to say that Mr. Baldwin wasn't acting with the prudence of a regular person, of a normal person. It was a movie set. They're playing pretend. He's handling a prop. And so I don't see how they can say he wasn't acting, as a normal person would be acting with the regular, prudence. So it's a very odd thing. And I'll tell you this, and having done criminal defense for 30 years, the prosecution ethically should never bring a case unless they can prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. This case is at best 50-50 from the get-go. It's at best 50-50. I just can't imagine what the reasoning is behind here. I would love to be a fly in the wall when the prosecution was spitballing, this case and thinking about how they're going to, prosecute it. I hope that the case wasn't brought simply because of the star power of Mr. Baldwin. That would be very, very unfortunate and an abuse of power by the local prosecutor. But I just think at best, this is a 50-50 case. No one is questioning that this was a mistake. This was just an accident. But, as you mentioned, they have an armorer on set who's already been prosecuted and convicted for some crazy reason. She was out shooting live rounds, a couple days before, and she was in charge of these weapons. And that weapon went from her control to Mr. Baldwin. And there's just no way anyone could say that he was acting recklessly by handling a prop weapon.
Well, I know that you've been mentioning that you're even confused as to why prosecutors brought on these charges for Alec Baldwin. Let's kind of play devil's advocate a bit, because his defense team has been trying for years now to just get these charges dismissed. And yet the judge continues to allow them to be brought into court. I mean, the trial is going to start. And it may be a very hard question to answer, especially because we're not sure what the judge is thinking. But let's maybe think about the prosecution and what they're going to bring to the table.
So, the judge really has very little power prior to trial. I guess they could file a probable cause motion and say there wasn't probable cause to hold Mr. Baldwin responsible for these charges. They could maybe file something like that, but very difficult for a judge to dismiss it politically and legally. It would be difficult to do that. This really lies with the prosecution. When you're a prosecutor, you have immense power and immense discretion to bring charges, to not bring charges. But ethically speaking, they must believe before they file that they can prove every element beyond a reasonable doubt. And if they don't believe that, they should not be bringing the case. Just as an objective observer, I've watched this case for the several years it's been unwinding. I just conceivably don't see how they could not have a reasonable doubt as to the element of whether or not he was acting recklessly.
I've heard this term being thrown around a lot when we watch courtroom proceedings, talking about a smoking gun. What kind of smoking gun, pardon the pun actually, but what kind of evidence would the prosecutors need possibly that they could bring to trial to say, this is why we chose to bring forth these charges?
So they would never provide their motivation. I mean, the motivations presume that a crime was committed, and that's why they're bringing the case. To be honest, I mean, I think in a different case, you might argue that if Mr. Baldwin had been out shooting rounds the night before, then you could argue, well, then he may not have been acting with the prudence of a regular person, of a normal person. But there's no evidence of that. He was simply handed this prop weapon. So I don't think the prosecution has a smoking gun. I think they're going forward on the facts as we know them, which is that he was handed a weapon from an armorer and he fired it thinking it was a prop weapon, and somehow they're going to try to bootstrap that onto him being reckless. I just don't see it. I think it's an ethical issue. And this is not the first time, unfortunately, something like this has happened. Back in the 1990s, a film was being shot called The Crow, and one of the actors was shot and killed in on that movie set. And very similar sort of facts. It's just kind of an accident. Charges were never brought in that case. It was in a different state. It was 30 years ago. But I think that was probably the right decision then, and I think that would have been the right decision now.
Speaking on the ethics of what prosecutors or want to do during these type of cases, do they have an obligation to perhaps Helena Hutchinson's family? Let's say they wanted these charges brought against the actor. Do prosecutors have the obligation to appease to her family?
They don't have the obligation to appease, the victims' families. Obviously, it's a very, very emotional issue for them. Of course, it's a horrible tragedy what occurred. So they don't have to appease them, but they should consult with them. After all, the prosecution represents the people of New Mexico, and that means the victims in this case. So they should always, talk to them, let them know what's going on. Just a matter of really professional courtesy. So technically, neither if Miss Hudgens had survived, she would not be the client of the prosecution. The prosecution has no client. They simply represent the interest of the people of New Mexico in the particular criminal case. So I'm sure that the tragic nature of it has had an effect because it's so sad. But that's why we pay district attorneys and prosecutors. They are supposed to act only on what the law shows and what the evidence shows, and not let emotion get into it. The family, of course, can sue civilly, and while that's small compensation for the loss of a loved one, that really is the only remedy they have directly. If that answers your question.
It does. Thank you. It gets kind of complicated, especially because I think a lot of people are wondering exactly why this trial is even going forward. Some people feel that maybe it's a civil lawsuit that could have been handled outside of court, but these are charges involuntary manslaughter. Tell us, what kind of punishment does this charge carry?
So Mr. Baldwin could do a maximum of 18 months. The armorer who was previously tried and convicted, she has been sentenced to the maximum. So that's the maximum Mr. Baldwin is facing currently.
Speaking on the ethics of prosecutors, I think it's an interesting point that you've brought and something we haven't really touched on, and kind of their role in bringing these charges forward. Is it possible that we'll see Alec Baldwin maybe after this trial bring a countersuit of his own?
You know, um, it's certainly something that would cross my mind. Of course, he needs to be found not guilty first. I really believe there's some serious ethical issues here. I've spoken with prosecutors. I've been a defense attorney myself for many years, but I've spoken with prosecutors about this case in California, and they are just flummoxed that this case is going forward. So, it certainly raises the question: was this done because someone had some aspirations or some political ambitions? I don't know, but it certainly raises that question. Just having done this work for many, many years, it just seems odd to bring a case on these facts, and it's sort of compounding a tragedy. So I think it's something that Mr. Baldwin and his legal team may look at, but of course they have to get a favorable verdict from a jury first.
All right, well, we'll just cross that bridge when we come to it, I guess. Let's get to something that we know is happening, which is the jury selection, what we started our conversation with. I've seen so many different specials with cases that get such high publicity. They've been in the headlines for years, just like Alec Baldwin's case. You pick a jury, and then after the fact, you kind of see that it was incredibly difficult to get a jury that was unbiased. It's incredibly difficult to have someone that is not familiar with the case, not familiar with Alec Baldwin. I know how this could hinder the outcome of this case. What kind of protections can the defense team have to try to make sure that Baldwin does get a fair trial?
Usually when it comes to questioning the jurors and conducting, even conducting their own investigations of each juror, the court gives pretty wide latitude for that. As you bring up, it's very important that, I mean, they're judging the facts of this case. It's very important that they aren't completely impartial. So, the defense team is essentially unhindered from, delving into jurors' backgrounds, and they can even If they feel it's getting into something personal, they can even go back in chambers and speak with with the jurors in person. But you're right, his fame does bring an element to this case. We recently just had the Trump trial, and arguably Mr. Trump is probably more famous than Mr. Baldwin. But they were able to find 12 jurors who appeared to be impartial. I'm not sure how they did that, but somehow they were able to find jurors who were not going to be prejudiced. So they should be able to do that here. My understanding it's it's a remote sort of rural county that may be more difficult as opposed to New York City that has millions of people. So maybe more of a challenge in this area. But the jurors or the defense team will be given wide latitude. Mr. Baldwin, of course, has enormous resources on his hand to make sure that each and every juror is in fact impartial.
Finally, Will, I'm just going to leave you with last thoughts here. What are you most looking forward to? What should we be on the lookout for as this trial finally beginning now after about 2 years, I believe it was, when this death first occurred?
I think I want what everyone wants, whether it's the judge, prosecution, defense. We want justice ultimately. At worst, this was a mistake. This was an accident. As a criminal defense attorney, I'm always very weary holding people criminally liable for things which are accidents or mistakes. And in this case, we even have another layer here, which is that Mr. Baldwin had no direct connection to this weapon. He was just getting handed a prop, so he's truly remote from any sort of liability, criminal or civil, really. So I just hope justice is done here, and in the end, that everyone can look at this case and look at the verdict and just say, okay, I think the law was followed and justice was prevailed.
Will Bruzzo, criminal defense attorney, we appreciate your time here at Live Now from Fox as jury selection about to be underway in the Alec Baldwin Rust trial. We appreciate your time and hope to check in with you as we see how this case progresses.
Thank you.